Okay, so I'm going to touch on a lot of the things that our other speakers tonight have already spoken on, and I'm going to start with something Sarah mentioned, which is the church committee. I think it's an important thing to look back on what the church committee was, because it's one of the few times that the intelligence apparatus of the United States has really been brought into question, and really there's been a genuine attempts to reform it. And I think Sarah did a very nice job of explaining how much of an abysmal failure that process has been. But I think it's also, so looking back, this is what Idaho Democrat Frank Church said in 1975. And I think it's important to understand that this was a very different time, and that a dictator hasn't really taken over, but something else has taken over. The neoliberal agenda, there's a lot of things you could call it, but something else has taken over our government and our country in that period of time. I have this slide here to demonstrate a specific era, because I think this is a very crucial time in our nation's history, and in the history and the trajectory of the defense establishment, and of which this entire NSA and surveillance infrastructure is obviously part of. So if you look here, there's a clear path throughout the 90s, right? The Cold War is over, and the internet is starting to take hold. It is becoming a dominant medium of communication. And the military establishment of the Cold War era, the kind of that Frank Church is talking about, is in trouble, right? Like to decrease year after year in spending, and then a miracle happens, right? Right at the nadir of our government spending, we recoalesce and find a new way to build up the system and to reinvigorate the military complex, and that's obviously September 11th that Sarah mentioned, and so, but it also, in our economy and all these things, we see that this is a shifting point where the military and tech industries begin to merge. And so here's just some stats on that. 70% of intelligence spending. And in DC they always talk about the revolving door, and there's a revolving door between Wall Street and government. There's a revolving door, there's a very real revolving door in the intelligence establishment. All the generals know that they're going to get that big job when they retire. A distinguished military career is a guarantee of a very lucrative private sector contracting career. And just for example, in New York City, they were going to pay David Petraeus $150,000 a year to teach one class, right, for one semester where he did none of the work, right? So this is I bring up Booz Allen Hamilton. There's many contractors, but Booz Allen Hamilton is a very interesting one, because James Clapper, who is the current director of national intelligence, was a Booz Allen executive. The guy who he took the job from, Mike McConnell, is currently a vice chairman at Booz Allen Hamilton. Former CIA director James Woolsey was also a vice president. And so this is the system that we have. And I don't want to say between 1975 to now, but over the last half century, we've seen our government and we've seen the executive branch of government massively expand and really just dwarf the other branches. And the executive is the branch that is most interested in secrecy, that is most likely to hide stuff from the public. And this is well known from the founding on. But when you combine this with the kind of ascendance of neoliberalism, you really see a military, technical, industrial complex, the corporate state, you can call it whatever you want, but where there's no legitimate distinction between big business, these tech industries, and government. They're all very, very much one entity. And so, going on to some programmatic, what is this entity trying to do, and mostly through the NSA, but there's, as Sarah mentioned, I think 19 or 17 intelligence agencies. The NSA is just the biggest and the richest. But this was mentioned earlier, the Total Information Awareness Program. And this was, they made the mistake of being honest, right? Like they made this insane logo, it's like, and Congress found out about this and defunded the program in 2003. So what did the NSA learn? What did the defense establishment learn? Don't tell Congress, right? Like that's what they learned. Keep Congress out. So what does that look like on the ground? We talked about Bluffdale a little bit. Here's just some stats on this thing, and it's really important to understand the scale. The magnitude of what they're trying to do is actually reveals the program, even though it's secret. So, a yottabyte is the term that's used here, because there's no word for this many zeros. And so, it's really important to understand this is not metadata that they're talking about here. This is not just networking and who's who, which is very important and which is incredibly invasive. But what they are trying to do, they are trying to capture the entirety of human communication. That is their goal. That is their stated objective, and they are building the hardware to do that. And so, Bill Binney, who we had a clip from earlier, a famous NSA mathematician, estimated that they're trying to basically capture all human communications and be able to store it for the next 100 years. So I think that it's important to understand that there are abuses that have taken place. But these guys, this is just getting started, right? Bluffdale goes online next month. Like, they're new at this game, and their ambitions are pretty serious. So here's just a few of the kind of abuses that we've seen already. I mentioned here, in 2009, this is the FISA court. This is the classified court saying that the NSA gives them flawed descriptions. They're troubled that oversight, the regime has never functioned effectively, right? This is the secret court saying this to the NSA. Of course, we couldn't know that they said this because it was a secret until we get the Snowden revelations. But these quotes from the FISA court, this is just on the few things that weren't redacted from that recently declassified FISA statement talking about how messed up the NSA is. I think these last 2 points I think are really also important to understand. That last week Reuters did a story on the DEA Special Operations Division, which is a part of the DEA that includes the FBI and the NSA and a bunch of other, dozen acronyms. And they explicitly are telling law enforcement agents how to recreate the evidence. So they get this illegal evidence or this NSA evidence or this, this secret surveillance evidence, and then they tell the cops on the ground how to fudge it so that the courts don't throw out well, I'm just going to tell you there's a truck that's going to be at a certain place at a certain time. You go there and figure out how to make the arrest happen, how to gather the evidence. So this is, when Obama goes up there, whoever goes up there and says there haven't been abuses, I mean, it's just not true. But it's not even the really scary part because, like I said, this is really just the beginning. So just to counter, in case anyone is actually believes that they don't need privacy or that they have nothing to hide, I think, take these questions to heart. Like, you're applying for a job. Like, what do you want that prospective employer to know and to not know, right? Like, anyone who says that they don't have something to hide, it's like, okay, so you don't have a password on your email, right? Like, you don't, like you don't lock your door, whatever. But one of these things I want to emphasize also is that none of us really know when we've broken the law. And I'm just talking about the federal law here, but like, nobody knows the extent of federal criminal law. That is true. Nobody knows. They don't know. People have studied this. One of the most comprehensive attempts to understand the scope of federal law was done by a guy named Ronald Gaynor for the DOJ in 1982, right? This was before even the big drug war stuff, before a lot of this terrorism law. In 1982, when after a 3-year exhaustive study, he was asked, he said, you'd have to die and resurrect me 3 times before I could give you an answer to that. And that's, what he found was about 23,000 pages, 3,000 discrete offenses, and that doesn't include regulations, which are not laws but have the force of law, and the estimates are somewhere between 10,000 and 300,000. So someone who's more recently really attempted to understand the scope of federal law, here's a good quote from John Baker at Louisiana State University. He said, "There is no one in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted on some federal crime." Just to add to that, the law that is used to go after hackers, and it's called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. A law professor who's a real expert on it basically said that, he said any internet user is potentially violating that law and could be put in jail by the federal government. So anyone who thinks they don't have something to hide or haven't broken the law, they're just wrong. Like, it's just a matter of choice whether they're going to be indicted or prosecuted. And the fact of the matter is they don't have to indict you to ruin your life. They just have to charge you. So I'm going to wrap up, but I want to got to wrap up with the Founding Fathers quote or something, right? So I'm going to, we've talked about the Fourth Amendment, but I think we need to understand the First Amendment implications of this, because the First Amendment is kind of important, right? And it's part of what creates a free society, and it's the backbone of our law that protects our ability to communicate, to organize, to work together. And I think it's really important that we understand that the First Amendment implicitly guarantees us privacy. It gives us a right to communicate. All of these founders communicated anonymously. They all used pseudonyms. They all used pseudonyms to attack each other, right? And so this idea of total surveillance is completely antithetical to the First Amendment and to a free society.
Ask one follow-up question with you to get, or just a comment, asking for a comment, I guess, about the extent, you say that everybody has probably has broken a law, but it seems like the role of discretion about who will actually be targeted, who is actually suspect, is a huge part of this. And I wonder if you have an opinion on, if the fact that we currently have a Democratic president has informed the way that the country has reacted to this, as opposed to if these revelations had come out under Bush, or thinking about these, now that we know about these practices moving forward, if we have a different president, that the who is targeted, who the focus is on, might shift.
Yeah. So I think who is targeted is. Yeah, there is discretion, I guess, but I mean, I think who's targeted, there's been a lot of consistency. Muslims are targeted, right? Like, we know that. Poor and minority communities are targeted, right? They already live in a surveillance state in many places, right? You can walk out in New York City, and be stopped and frisked if you're black in New York City. That's just going to happen, right? So those are the realities of who's being targeted. I don't think there's been a significant change in terms of Republican, Democrat. I think the most disturbing aspect in terms of who's president is that traditionally civil liberties and a lot of these things are more protected by Democrats, and so that, like, a lot of that support has just fallen off because Obama is a Democrat. But I also think that these NSA revelations, as indicated by the vote to defund, was a coalition of the right, the libertarian right, and the progressive left. I mean, progressive for congressional purposes, at least, right? So that it's actually, I think there is a solid center of the political establishment, the corporate Democrats, the corporate Republicans, that are going to go for this, and then there's a few on the edges who are willing to fight it.
So I know Rose Regina is going to hopefully lighten us up a little bit, give us some ideas about what we can do. I know there's a little bit more about exactly how this is all taking place, what some of the processes are, but then hopefully we can end with, like, what we can do, what can we take away, what can we share with our friends to kind of protect ourselves from a lot of these things that are happening that are really scary.
And finish up your questions. People will be coming around to collect the questions.
So first, I'm actually going to talk about something really scary. And then I'll talk about the happier parts. So the first idea I want to introduce is the idea of threat modeling. This is a concept from computer security where you basically look at a network or a piece of software or hardware and try to determine how vulnerable it is and in what ways and to whom. And I think that this is a really good idea in terms of sort of giving us all a framework of thinking about security and thinking about our digital security. So basically, the idea that I want to get across is maybe we don't want to talk about things in terms of, is this secure, isn't this secure, but how secure is this and from whom? Because that is going to change what things you do or don't want to do. One interesting example of this that I'm a huge fan of because it's fascinating is that even if you're not connected to the internet, what you're doing on a computer can still be surveilled. This is called Van Eck phreaking. And basically, there are ways of monitoring the electromagnetic emissions from a monitor or LCD, and those can be analyzed. And so conceivably, men in dark suits in a van outside your house can be reading what you're reading on your computer, even if your computer is not connected to the internet. But I really, really doubt that this is the biggest security threat to anyone in this room. I think that there are a lot more practical ways that the government is surveilling us. But I want to put that out there because I think that it's a pretty extreme example to show why you can't say, is this secure, isn't this secure, but that there are always more questions to ask. And even beyond that, if you are really good about all of your online communication, but you don't encrypt your home hard drive, if the police come in and confiscate your computer, they can still access that information. If you keep all of your notes on paper, well, one, you can lose the paper, which I know I have done several times. But if you're writing on something in public, there are surveillance cameras everywhere, and some of them are strong enough to pick up what you're writing. So it's more just becoming aware of security on a spectrum and sort of thinking a little bit more deeply instead of just going, oh my goodness, the internet isn't secure, or my email isn't secure, and knowing that there's so much more complication to all of the questions that we need to ask. I also want to bring up physical security really quickly because a lot of what we've been talking about with things like encryption are more on a digital level, but there have been several proof of concepts that you can introduce viruses onto specifically smartphones by using something that looks like a phone charger but actually has a tiny, tiny computer inside of it that will then transmit a virus to your device. So there are all different kinds of security, and what has mostly been talked about regarding NSA surveillance is only one small sliver of it. I also want to go ahead and define data and metadata, because both of those words have been used a whole bunch, especially by a lot of media sources, and I know that I've gotten quite a few questions from a lot of my friends about what exactly they refer to. So the OED defines data as facts and statistics collected together for reference or analysis. And I think that's a really great definition, but I think you could also just say information, and that would get most of the point across. So Tom brought up metadata, and so have a couple of the other panelists, but when Tom brought it up, he specifically talked about phone calls, and metadata is actually a much broader idea than just the information that he described related to phone calls. One way of describing metadata is it's data about data, or information about information. And so a good way of thinking about this is if you take letter sent through the post office, for example, everything on the envelope is the metadata. The to address, the from address, the postage stamp, the postage cancellation mark, and anything else written on the outside of the envelope, such as important financial documents enclosed or a message from some random famous person to our supporters. And it's the same thing with email, so it's everything in the email header, including the subject line. You could also think of it as metadata is the card catalog information for a book, or the equivalent for anything else. So there are different ways that metadata is used. It isn't just used in nefarious purposes. Sometimes it's really useful. Many of us make use of it every day. So another group besides the government that is hugely interested in metadata are companies, and one of the ways that that comes through really clearly is with targeted advertisement, which I'm sure all of us have encountered, which I just want to bring up because that's another kind of surveillance that many of us encounter on the internet, and there are features like Do Not Track that do some things for that, and also just to be aware that we give away information incredibly freely. We give away information when we register for random websites online to play stupid games. We give away information in all sorts of ways without even really thinking about it. So a little bit more back on topic. With security, there are always trade-offs. Generally, the trade-off is between security and convenience, or security and price. And I want to bring that up because I think that there are a lot of reasons that we are at the point where we are, and it's important to remember what the barriers to some of the best practices are so that we can kind of prepare ourselves for them, and we can start talking to our friends about all of these issues in a way that acknowledges why they might be hesitant to make certain changes that would be better for all of us. So in terms of what you can do for yourself, one of the best things you can do is encrypt your email, encrypt your hard drives. And a good way of doing that is PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy, and that is a specific kind of encryption that uses an asymmetric key. And what this means is that the way that it is encrypted and decrypted require different keys, and that's a lot more secure. And it's also important for understanding how PGP in email works, because basically you give people your public key, and then they use that to encrypt the message for you, and you use your private key to decrypt it so that you can read it. And it's also important for understanding how authentication and signing in PGP works, but that is much less important to most people than the encryption aspect. Another option is using a VPN or virtual private network where you basically have an encrypted tunnel between you and a server, and everything in that encrypted tunnel is very, very private. The unfortunate part is that once it gets out of the encrypted tunnel, it's no longer encrypted. It just goes to a website. So whatever information you send through a VPN is basically vulnerable in the same ways that it would be coming directly from your computer, but it isn't necessarily traceable back to you. Tor is basically a VPN. Tor is formerly known as the Onion Router, and basically it is a piece of software that bounces your data through a couple of different continuously shifting nodes. It has some specific vulnerabilities, but it's something that gets brought up a whole lot, so I wanted to just make sure to mention that because I know that that's something that I've been asked about a bunch recently. One idea that has also been kind of put out there as something that you can maybe do to give yourself a little bit more privacy is using a burner phone, since it's not necessarily traceable back to you, and therefore the government doesn't know it's you making those calls. The unfortunate thing is that social network analysis means that if you take your burner phone and call all of your friends' numbers and text all of your friends' numbers in exactly the same pattern that you have been, and that happens to correlate with your old number going dead, it's relatively easy statistically to say, oh yeah, that's that person, and this is their new phone number. On the topic of things that maybe aren't as great protection as one might hope is incognito or private browsing. It's really great for keeping what you're browsing private from other people who might be using your computer, but as the little thing that pops up in Chrome says, it doesn't protect you from someone standing behind you. It doesn't protect you from spyware on your computer, and it doesn't actually protect you from NSA surveillance. So just know the limitations of your tools. One thing that some people have mentioned as a possible way of being surveilled less is sending things by postal mail, since that is in many ways less surveilled than digital communications. There's been a recent revelation that the USPS actually takes a photograph of every piece of mail that comes through all of its facilities. I did a little bit more research into that, and it's specifically because of the computerized sorting mechanisms that they use, though some of that information has already been turned over to law enforcement agencies based on warrants, and the Postal Service claims that they only retain that data for 7 to 30 days. So there's always the fallback of, well, just do everything in person, and that's what will keep you safe, and that's what will keep things private. But the truth is that the Department of Homeland Security is developing something called the Biometric Optical Surveillance System, or BOSS. And the NYPD has the Domain Awareness System, and the ACLU released a report back in July talking about license plate scanners as used by various local law enforcement agencies, and I strongly recommend that you actually go look at that report. They have great infographics that show not only how widespread it is, but how varied the policies are on it. And I think that it's important to understand how there's kind of a little bit of a mess, and there isn't a lot of regularity, and that's because there isn't oversight and there aren't laws developed yet. And that's something we need to be talking about and actively addressing. But the big things that you can do are make smarter choices as you can. So encrypt your mail, encrypt your email, encrypt your hard drive. Choose RiseUp, not Gmail. Choose DuckDuckGo, not Google. Choose SpiderOak, not Dropbox. None of these are perfect, but little by little, they do add up. Additionally, when you choose to use alternative services, you support those services and you encourage the development of better alternative services. So maybe PiratePad isn't where Google Docs is yet, and maybe there are still times when you really just are going to end up using Google Docs because it's what you need to do in order to get your work done. But when you can, make the more progressive choice. opt for the alternatives. In terms of what you can do to help all of us, well, again, encrypt things. Make encryption the norm. When your friends see email messages coming from you that include this like random splattering of like characters that they can't quite tell why is that even there, it's a really great chance to have that conversation about what encryption means and why you're using it. It also just normalizes it, and we need to normalize encryption. We need to normalize these sorts of considerations. And the best way to do that is to start doing it yourself and to explain to all your friends why you're doing it. Another big thing that we can do collectively is legislation and oversight. And as much as it pains me, this is an area where we really need to rely somewhat heavily on a lot of the very traditional means of social change in terms, or no, that's not true. They're not traditional means of social change. They're traditional means of social stagnation. I'm sorry, I couldn't keep a straight face through that statement. But we need to talk about a new church committee. We need to talk about what we want to see in terms of oversight. EFF has a great page up talking about what to specifically look for in new legislation addressing that. They do a great overview. I strongly recommend you go read it. I think it's also important to recognize that NSA surveillance and government surveillance in general of this electronic nature is part of a much, much larger network of surveillance. Right now, we already know that just what has been leaked is international, it's somewhat extra-governmental, and the truth is that things like CALEA, the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which was passed almost 20 years ago in 1994, has huge implications not only for us as Americans or people living in the United States, but because of the dominance of American-based telecom companies and innovations, it has major, major impact all over the globe. CALEA created built-in holes in security because of the requirement that law enforcement agencies be able to get real-time access to initially telephony, but then when the law was updated, broadband internet and voice over IP, there are mandated security holes into all of these pieces of technology. And while we may be relatively safe in a lot of ways, those holes can also be used by foreign governments against their own citizens. And this has international implications. And so when we allow our government to pass laws that make things really, really that easy for, say, the NYPD to get access to your phone communications, it also makes it that easy for repressive regimes internationally to get access to the phone conversations of their dissidents. And I wanted to put that out there because that's also another thing to bring up in terms of metadata. Metadata also gets included in a lot of computer files, and that includes video and photo files. And so that's also a concern when you release photos or when people say during the Green Revolution released photos, that those photos could be tracked back to them and their cell phones. So I just want to make sure we understand how our telecommunication really directly relates to telecommunication of people who are in much more immediate threat than most of us are. So part of this is just that we've let this expectation but on the part of law enforcement that they'll be able to access this information easily kind of create the norm. And I think that two really good examples of why those norms are dangerous and why we need to push back and we need to speak up and say, actually, maybe not, are drones and Guantanamo. I bring up drones because basically these are bombings based on generally somewhat speculative information. And the De Bala wedding party airstrike in 2008 in Afghanistan killed 47 civilians. And that was a wedding party, and it was basically a product of not being able to adequately distinguish what a gathering of armed militants looked like from what a wedding party looked like. And that's something we need to think about in terms of how much we're willing to let analysis of information in a somewhat abstracted manner guide what our government does or doesn't do. Additionally, a lack of understanding and a lack of cultural understanding to adequately analyze accurately and correctly the information at hand is why a lot of the Uyghurs, which are ethnically Chinese Muslims, are detained and are still detained in Guantanamo, is because our government didn't quite know what to make of the information it was getting. And it made some assumptions, and there were very, very real consequences for a bunch of people because of that. I think another example of our government having information and not necessarily acting in the way we would most like is stop and frisk. So the NYPD had kept a database of everyone who was stopped and frisked, and then they had gone in and they had used that to determine who to further investigate. And that is now no longer the case. The NYPD has agreed to stop keeping that database, but that mentality for why they were allowed to keep that database and why it was okay to do that is so closely tied to why the NSA felt justified in accessing this information. And we need to start having a public conversation about where we're going to draw the line of information retention, even just information possession. And if we don't speak up and we don't actively confront that, we're probably not going to get the results we would most like. So the NYPD ending the keeping of this database is a pretty big win. It's a really big win for the people it affects every day. But it's also a win for all of us because it shows that there is hope, that we can kind of maybe make some progress. I think another example of a place where we've gotten a little bit of a win that can give us a little bit of hope is United States versus Jones, which was a recent Supreme Court decision this summer that the government cannot track your car using GPS for 28 days without a warrant. I'm pretty excited about that, mostly because I need to be pretty excited about something. Especially given that we all carry around tracking devices. So, maybe that's not the hugest win, but it's a little chink in the armor, and we have to start somewhere. I think that it's also important to realize that public opinion is basically on our side. There was a New York Times article on the 13th with the headline, "NSA leaks makes plan for cyber defense unlikely," basically saying that because of the recent revelations about, or not even revelations, but the recent verification of NSA surveillance and its extent meant that there just wasn't the support for a digital equivalent of Star Wars. So I think that's good. I'm really glad that that isn't about to get funded. And yesterday there was a court victory in EFF versus DOJ, which was a FOIA action where federal court ordered the DOJ to turn over an 86-page opinion on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and basically that opinion showed that the Foreign Information Surveillance Court opinion held that the NSA surveillance was unconstitutional. So we are making little wins. This is a huge, huge thing, and it takes time. I wish it didn't. I wish this was instant, but we can build on these wins. As Tom brought up, the Guardian destroyed a bunch of hard drives that had information that was related to national secrets or national security. And as Alfredo brought up, the internet is about communication. But one of the neat things about the destruction of the Guardian's hard drives is no information was actually lost, because all of it was already backed up other places outside of the UK. Like, we didn't lose anything. They can go in and they can destroy piles and piles of hard drives, but we still know everything that was there. And that's neat, and that's different, and that makes censorship a lot more difficult. So I want to throw out there one other reason to be really, really hopeful. And it actually isn't one reason, it's a whole bunch of reasons. And they are Edward Snowden, Bill Binney, J. Kirk Wiebe, Thomas Drake, Ed Loomis, Diane Rourke, Chelsea Manning, née Bradley Manning, and John Kirikou. And those are all whistleblowers who stood up. So we're not alone.
As they're bringing up the questions, I guess I'll just throw one question out there. I guess I'll focus it to Sarah, and that how do if they're judges, how are they appointed to the FISA court?
Okay, I'm sorry. Pardon
So
me?
the judges that are, how are they appointed to the FISA court? How does, like, the people that are making these decisions, how are they put in that position?
They're appointed by the Chief Justice of the United States. So they're federal judges that are appointed to a certain term, I can't remember, and rotates. There's also a FISA appeals court and similar.
And
Does
so
that
I
answer
know
your
that,
question?
yeah, no, thank you. And I know that our president, when he was a candidate, he had spoken a lot about, like, strengthening laws for whistleblowers so that we protect federal workers who expose waste, fraud, and abuse. But yet, our current administration has prosecuted more people under the Espionage Act than all prior administrations. Is there a legal difference between a whistleblower and someone who can be prosecuted under the Espionage Act?
Well, the Espionage Act is narrower in that it needs to be a charge of basically aiding the enemy, right, of espionage. That's what it means. So it's certainly possible for whistleblowers to be charged under other types of legislation, right? So there's other secrets, other agreements, other rules against sharing secrets. So it's certainly not only espionage. It's not the only option for prosecuting whistleblowers. And from corporations, there's usually specific restrictions in terms of your employment and contracts and things. There's the national security clearance, secrets, there are different levels of it. So there's actually a whole array of ways that people can get prosecuted for sharing information.
So are there any laws that are in place that will protect people that do bring this information out?
Not that I'm aware of right now. There at different times there's been proposals for whistleblower protection legislation, but as far that some of the lawyers in the room might be able to answer this better than me, but as far as I'm aware, there is not currently any that's not in place.
Well, the questions have been conveniently categorized into tech, legal, and solutions that I can see so far. And since we were just talking about legal stuff, maybe we can start with a legal question, and I don't know if we'll be able to get to all the questions. I think we allotted like a half an hour for questions, so we can try to keep this moving pretty quickly. But starting with a legal question, how can this affect criminal prosecutions? Which was, besides I already mentioned, it says. So Sarah, you talked a little bit about the fact that FISA court information found that basically there had been a wall between FISA court and criminal court, and that wall broke down. So maybe that's a question for you. How else can this affect criminal prosecution?
The question is how the FISA court can affect criminal prosecutions in the United States, as I understand it?
It doesn't specify, but I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, that's it. It's a broad and unsupervised, largely uncourt supervised process of gathering tremendous amounts of data. And that data is available to various government agencies, including a wide range of law enforcement agencies. And now that that wall has been broken down, it's now legitimate, or they're allowed to use that information to prosecute you. So it's a huge amount of information. There's one interesting case in Florida from a few weeks ago, actually, where a judge allowed a criminal defendant was asking the government to produce metadata information because he thought it would help him prove that he wasn't where the government was saying he was, and that it was going to be exculpatory potentially for him. And the judge allowed it. They said, you can find it, get it, you know. And then on the other side of it, there's a lot of questions for criminal defendants everywhere. I mean, our rights to private communications with our lawyers is legitimately in question. I mean, there are what they call minimization procedures in place, but we've only, one of the leaked documents talked about minimization, but that was just for one of the programs, and I personally don't have a lot of confidence that it's followed very strictly. So I think it really does have serious implications and risks for anybody that potentially is caught up in the criminal legal system, which of course is all of us.
It's an interesting point that the way that surveillance can also be used to exonerate somebody, though. Like, I'm thinking of the Jatik Reed video, where the police report completely contradicted what the video, what the surveillance video showed. So it's complicated.
It's a bit like DNA that way, right? There's a lot of DNA-based exonerations, but of course, and like fingerprints, there's more than that, though. It's another way that they collect information on us in order to have it and use it against us.
Should we do a tech question?
Which of the NSA systems that Snowden and other leakers revealed focus on integration of data from the systems that do collection and initial processing? It goes on to suggest that there must be modern versions of the Promise software developed by the Department of Justice in the mid-70s.
So basically this question's dwelling on how software integration takes place from the various data systems that do capture and the initial processing and stuff like that. And the answer to that is I haven't the slightest idea, neither do you, neither does most people in the United States of America. That's part of the secrecy, and those are part of the leaks.
Sorry. I would just point out that Google and IBM and all these other companies are interested in data analysis. Massive data analysis, data mining is a big industry, and it's the same companies that are doing it in the private sector that are contracted with the NSA. So the systems are out there, are used for commerce and what have you, and those companies are being hired to analyze NSA's data.
This one isn't categorized, but I think it's an interesting question because I think it might speak to a question kind of from people who don't have the exact far left political inclinations of maybe some of the people who are here. Looking at our current national security status, what is the balance between defending the right to privacy of the American citizen and the duty of the U.S. government to defend the American citizen from terrorism? That's obviously it's a really clear question. It's a question that I think is so politicized that it kind of is difficult to get an answer that isn't imbued with ideology.
So I think it's actually a pretty easy question to answer in terms of what the NSA is doing is not actually protecting us. They don't need to be monitoring everyone's email. There are more targeted approaches that don't have the added side effect of tracking all of us. If you look at how how terrorist networks operate, well, it doesn't indicate that we need to be spending all of the time and money and effort to implement this kind of surveillance network. And our government is implementing this kind of surveillance network because it wants this kind of surveillance network, not because there is an indication that this is the best way of protecting us. And I think that that's an incredibly, incredibly important part of understanding why this whole thing is ridiculous and unnecessary and not at all about keeping us safe.
So the next question, I think it speaks to something that Abhi touched on, which is, and the question as it's written is, if ordinary activities are in fact illegal and everyone frequently commits federal crimes, how do I know what to do privately? Is it possible for an innocent person to be safe from prosecution? If not, what is the purpose of maintaining the privacy we have or can have? And I think that maybe it also speaks to like maybe having some idea of what are some examples of things that we do in everyday life that are actually breaking some kind of obscure law that we may not know about.
Okay, there's a lot of parts to that question, but I mean, so an example of breaking the law is if when you fill out a terms of service agreement on whatever website, if you don't read every 80 million pages of that form and abide by that, prosecutors have gone after people for that and said that that's a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If you're 13 and you sign up for Facebook, that says whatever the limit is, right? So there are definitely examples of that. I mean, to the point of what can you, if there's no, I guess that the question kind of also is saying that if they can get you for anything, what's the point of doing anything? I mean, I don't have an answer. That's something you have to figure out for yourself. But I think the point is that the point that I was trying to make is that nobody is immune, and that it's a cop-out answer to say I have nothing to hide. It's just not true, and it's avoiding the issue, which is a government run amok and a system that is unaccountable. And just to address another issue of what Rosagina just said, I thought it was very good. We're not in a position to make these decisions because we don't know what they're doing. We can't decide what that balance is because they have decided for us in a completely untransparent, non-democratic way. And like, that's the big problem right there.
This is a super legal question. I'm not even sure if I understand what it means, but I'm just going to read it. It's from Mo. And the question is, why can't the evidence the NSA finds be used without parallel construction? Explain the exclusionary rule.
Want me to try? You want to try?
I mean, the point is there that if evidence is illegally obtained, it cannot be used in court. And that's what the Fourth Amendment gives us. And the problem with that, with what the DEA is doing, is what they're doing is they're taking evidence that is illegally obtained, unconstitutionally obtained, and telling people how to reconstruct it using constitutional methods. And we have no way of knowing how often that happens. You know, anecdotally talk to defense attorneys, and there's fishy stuff that happens all the time, especially in high-profile cases, but what are they going to do? You know, the courts are not receptive to that. No one's going to listen to an attorney that says the NSA gave the cops this information and then the cops busted the guy. No, the point is we don't know what this system is doing in secret because it's secret.
So there's one that kind of, I'm trying to combine a couple ones so that we can keep it moving. And so this one is, what kind of cultural practices can individuals and groups participate in and initiate in their communities that combat, to effectively combat the surveillance state? And Rose-Regina, you got into that a little bit in your talk, but do people have stuff to add about how communities can come together to combat this?
I'll get one quick shout out. There's going to be a crypto party. Look at Blue Stocking's website. There's going to be a crypto party sometime in the middle of September. A crypto party is like an activist internet counter surveillance tools. So it's like hands-on. And if you Google that, if you don't live in New York, Google crypto party, go to one, figure it out.
Beyond that, there's a lot of non-tech based stuff related to just knowing your rights. And one excellent thing you can do is organize Know Your Rights trainings in your community. They're really important, and they're especially important for people who have more encounters with the state in a not so fun way.
Another thing that we can and all should do is to support information activists that are taking action that is different from the stuff that we are in a position to do ourselves. And there's a lot of people out there that have really put themselves at risk in order to get this information to us. And there's a lot that we need to keep them in mind.
So again, this is another one of the multi-part questions. This again is under the tech category. How does the U.S. government analyze all the data pulled from XKeyscore and other surveillance databases? And here are the parts. Do they look for keywords, linguistic patterns? What are the markers for information that are considered useful and in relation to what?
Use keywords, and the keywords are politically based. See, I need to go back to the Rose Regina superb thing that she just did. My niece here, her excellent explanation about terrorism. You got to remember that you live in a country governed by the world's greatest terrorist. And that terrorist doesn't give a flying crap and a rolling donut about protecting you. There is no connection between. They're protecting a bunch of rich people. They're not protecting you. And they are willing to do what they did in Afghanistan to that wedding party. If that is not terrorism, I don't know what terrorism is. Can you imagine going to a wedding party and these guys fly drones and bomb you, and then they start laughing about it? That's terrorism. So that actually has a connection with what I was about to say, even though it allowed me to vent. But the series of keywords that they put together are not based on logic of human beings. They are based on policy initiatives of the moment. And so they may be, as Avi was saying, there is a lot of stuff that they use in keywording information in relationship to Arab people, Muslim people, Islamic stuff, particular countries. If you use any of that language in your email, you probably are hitting one of their algorithms, one of their email keywords. And there are a lot of stuff like that. And it shifts based on the policies that are being put forward. So you can't avoid that. The point is to oppose them and take them on politically. In other words, people say, how do we keep surveillance from the internet? By using the internet to organize against these fools that are conducting the surveillance. That's the only way to do it, I think. Go ahead.
So the Department of Homeland Security released what I have referred to as a naughty word list back in, I think, 2010, 2011. And I had too much time one night, and I went through, and I realized that I had used over 80% of those words in email or on social media in connection to work or school only. Like, not even talking about my unpaid activism, just in connection to things that I had studied in class or was getting paid to work on. And I happen to hit a bunch of those categories just because of specific projects I've worked on, but one of my big takeaways from that is, especially because so much of those words that I hit were related to public health, is that maybe one of the best things you can do is actually talk to people about all of those things you know you should be talking to people about. And just keep going over and over again and bring it up and be that person who's like, So yeah, you know those drone strikes.
I think maybe we'll do. I'm going to try to combine my remaining questions into one, and then we can do.
Right, and this, I mean, yeah. So the question is, how do other countries rank on data collection, spying to the U.S.? I know a lot of the information is private. Do we have any idea of where we rank, or as opposed to what other countries, like what the recently there's been a lot of talk about the Germans, the German agencies and the British agencies, and what they're sharing with us, or what some of the people, maybe with other agencies that we're not sharing information. How do we rank in what we're collecting, maybe internationally and domestically?
Well, one of the ways I like to think about this is it's like another arms race. And it's one that the United States has been building capacity in for quite a lot of years. And its stated goal, and I think what it has achieved, is global information dominance. So just like, and that impacts global relations in the same ways that the nukes do, right? The United States gets an unprecedented amount of power in all decision-making globally and is able to do things like not join the International Criminal Court and make side deals with everybody in the world because of the scale of the power that they have. And I think it's pretty clear that the United States has information dominance as well. And so one of the reasons I think that some of the Europeans and the Chinese were so freaked by hearing some of these, you're right, revelations isn't the best word, but this new information about them being targets of this surveillance by the United States as well, which was part of what was talked about, is that it just illustrates that point. Everybody has to bow to the Americans. And the Europeans, I think as was made clear when they downed the plane with Morales on it, when they thought maybe Snowden was going to be on board, to me it's quite clear that the level of dominance the U.S. has.
Yeah, and if I can just say also, you know, there's this thing called the Five Eyes, which is led by the United States, and it includes the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And that's the largest information sharing network in the world for intelligence information. And I also wanted to point out something that you were just speaking to. You know, the U.S. throws around its power in order to leverage influence all the time. August 1st, there was a leak that exposed the U.S. paying £100 million to the UK to develop surveillance technologies. And that wasn't like, you know, purely a humanitarian goal, you know. It's so that we can use that technology. And they even said, quote, to secure access to and influence over intelligence gathering programs.
It's also important to know that the majority of the internet infrastructure and so many of the major internet providers are US based. So, I mean, in terms of global collection, like it's USA #1 for sure.
So going off that for a final question that I'm going to try to combine some different things people bring up regarding data collected by private companies, selling of data for profit, and the distinction between government surveillance and corporate surveillance. I mean, is there a meaningful distinction between government surveillance and corporate surveillance? And just to add to that, which do you fear the most? Which is part of that question.
One of the most interesting revelations, or if we don't like that word, whatever, Edward Snowden put out there is how much, it really bringing into the public consciousness how much of this stuff is private. And, you know, I don't know who to fear the most, but when you put this level of power in, you know, it's bad enough that it's in government hands, but then when it's in government hands that is completely compromised because they're just going through this revolving door of private interest, it just opens up so many more avenues for abuse. And I think it's just look at the fact that Edward Snowden was working for Dell, and then whatever, when he released the stuff, he was working for Booz Allen Hamilton, but he had worked for all these different private companies. This guy, not a particularly high-level guy, got what appears to be tens of thousands of documents, And they don't even know the extent of what he got, as indicated by the fact that they'll say something one day, and the next day they'll release something that said that they're lying, right? So they don't know what he has. He released it to the public. We have no idea what another Edward Snowden has done privately, or to a foreign government, or to whoever, right? The point is, they don't know what he did, and that means we really don't know what they're doing.
So I would say I don't have enough information to know who to fear the most on that. And I think it's good to remember that there are known unknowns, unknown unknowns. But basically, I think what you should fear the most is going to depend on what's the biggest threat to you, and that isn't necessarily going to be the same for everyone. And that for some of us, we're going to fear government surveillance the most. But for other people, corporate surveillance may be a much more immediate threat, but that there isn't a strict line between the two. And so when you talk to people about this, talk to them about both and draw the connection between the two, because it's all of it or none of it. You can't separate it that easily.
The traditional separation, such as it was between corporations and government, is eroding. And that is the legal trend of the moment politically. You have this increment in the relationship, the tightening of the relationship between corporations and government, and that's what you have now. There are some differences in the types of surveillance that's being done. Corporate surveillance is huge, deep, and very, very wide. They take a lot of information about what you do when you go to purchase stuff online and everything like that. I mean, you can figure it out. You go and purchase stuff online, and the next time you go and log in, the guy knows you. So, oh yeah, no, hi, good to see you back. You want, more diapers, or more wine, or and who your friends are, and if you go on Facebook or anything, they know who all your friends are and who you've been talking to. So they have that information, but they'll turn it over to the government at the snap of a finger. They don't even require legal documentation. Most of the time, the government just tells them, listen, you got to give us this information on this person, and they will now turn it over. They no longer fight. They are partners. And that's what's scary, is that any pretense of separation is a thing of the past.
A few days ago, LavaBit, which was a secure email provider, shut down. And they shut down after, no one knows for sure, but, well, they have a gag order. So they have a gag order. But from getting a national security letter and going to be compelled to turn over their servers. So really, when we start to think about the corporations and the government, we need to start supporting businesses that are doing the opposite, that will not cooperate with the government requests, because very often that's where we find the progressive businesses that are actually going to be willing to fight for us.
So since Tom brought up LavaBit, I just want to mention Secret Circle, because it's a really good example of the chilling effect that the confirmation of NSA surveillance and the going after of a specific provider has brought. Secret Circle shut down their email because basically they didn't want to be put in the situation that they perceived LavaBit as being put in.
Huge thanks to the panel, Alfredo Lopez, Sarah Hogarth, Abby Hassan, Rose Regina Lawrence, and Thomas Hinsey. And Mutant Legal for putting this together.
Yeah, and I hope everyone takes the handouts. There's a lot of, there's the bios for everyone that's spoken tonight, which we're really appreciative of them coming out and sharing this information are all on there. There's the great word key on the back, so when you go and you talk to your friends and you spread out the so much to lose message, you can kind of refer back to that to kind of refresh your mind. Definitely want to thank Molly.
And thank you, Nathan.
Thank you.
And also huge thanks to Judson for hosting this. That's really awesome.
And also, I just want to thank some of the sponsors, which were NLG, the Agag Drupal Collective, who brought some of the food, Rankin and Taylor, who printed out everything for us tonight, Judson for the space, and the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. They want you to know that if you go to the back of the table where the wine is back there, the Defense Fund table, they've left some information. Definitely grab one of these on your way out. We definitely appreciate that. And thank all of you I know it's late. It's Thursday night. It's late. Everyone came and stayed through, so definitely appreciate that. Yes, spread the message. So much to lose. Let everyone know that this is really important stuff.